And now, while they're coming up, I'd like to introduce our next round of presenters on building a national network for drug safety. As Janet mentioned, this will complement some of the ideas included at the end of her presentation. And again, the focus here is getting some ideas on the table for discussion to help shape the moving forward on these policy issues as effectively as possible. So joining us to do that will be Marcus Wilson, Rich Platt, and Janet Marchibroda. Marcus is president of HealthCore, which is part of WellPoint Health Networks. He previously was the strategic research partner for WellPoint Pharmacy Management, and as a faculty member of the University of the Sciences of Philadelphia, he developed an outcomes research and patient education division, and this a spinoff of this program was the start of HealthCore, which works closely with WellPoint on issues related to surveillance and learning from the actual experience of its members. Rich Platt is the professor and chair of the Department of Ambulatory Care and Prevention at the Harvard Medical School. His research focuses on the epidemiology, consequences, and prevention of nosocomial infections, on infectious diseases, and on pharmacoepidemiology, including a large amount of work related to the use of HMO network populations and extensive electronic data to identify patterns and make effective interventions. His recent research has also involved developing consortia of HMOs for this purpose, and he works with the CERTS program that Janet alluded to earlier. And then finally, Janet Marchibroda is the CEO of the eHealth Initiative and its foundation, which are both Washington-based independent, nonprofit organizations whose missions are to improve the quality, safety, and efficiency of healthcare through information and information technology. Janet previously served as the executive director of Connecting for Health, a public-private sector initiative, and that was designed to catalyze actions on a national basis to drive electronic connectivity. And recently, Janet has been doing a lot of work, which Janet Woodcock alluded to before, in terms of piloting some of the methods and ideas using electronic databases that could eventually be part of this active surveillance Sentinel system. They're going to do an overview of some of the issues and frameworks, again expanding on some of the issues that Janet raised earlier, and then we're going to talk about it a bit. So I think Marcus, are you starting off?
I suppose that's the case. Thank you, Mark. The Janet Woodcock, be careful which Janet's I point out, right? The what we're going to put forth, I think, in a few minutes is a diagram that we think is a good starting point. And I think the starting point, we're going to go back to one of Mark McClellan's first comments is this diagram is meant not as the answer, but the beginning of the discussion for a lot of the work that we think needs to be done in terms of constructing this system that was pointed out by Dr. Van Eschenbach and Dr. Woodcock. So as we started this endeavor several months back to begin the construct of this diagram, that we hope serves as the beginning of the start for the whole safety initiative, we thought the most important aspect was to set forth basic principles for a system such as this. So that as we make decisions, both leading up to this meeting and after this meeting, in terms of what this system ultimately will look like, that we make those decisions within the framework of those principles. And so the key things to think about are one of the goals, and our goals are in four basic categories. One is we want to improve accuracy of safety detecting adverse events. We want to improve the speed in which we do it. We want to improve our acuity, especially in looking at the reality that risk and benefit is not equal between all populations, so size matters in this case to be able to get to some of that acuity. And we want efficiency. We know that the current cost structure in terms of generating evidence, looking specifically at the clinical trial environment, is not sustainable when we get into this size of an endeavor. So we have to make this something that the system itself can reasonably fund. So these principles, as we sort of set forth, was pointed out early on, patient privacy is key. We always want to protect patient privacy, and I think that has to be very close to all of our decision making. The other is that we realize that there's no one data source out there that holds all the answer, that has all the elements, that has the size you need in terms of detecting some of these events, nor does it have representation from all the different populations that we know we need to understand in order to get to that acuity we talked about. So we know we're going to have to put together complementary data sources. The other is that there's one really important principle when it comes to using the current electronic healthcare data, and that is that what we're talking about is the repurposing of the data. The data weren't originally, none of the systems that are out there were originally designed to do adverse event detection. And so what we have to do is be very careful in how we use these data for generating evidence. And so if you think about all the different data sources that are out there, each data source has its own idiosyncrasies, has its own nuances, and in many cases have many non-apparent confounding factors. An example of that is, even within our own WellPoint data, which represents about 35 million lives, we have tens of thousands of benefit designs, different benefit designs throughout those health plans in which we're part of. Each one of those benefit designs holds the potential to bias the flow of data through that system. So understanding those benefit designs, the potential impact, are very important. So as we think about this, one of the principles that we've put forth on this is that you need to keep the data close to its source, because those are the individuals, those are the organizations that understand the data the most, and they can help you interpret those data as those data are brought out for this purpose. The other point that was brought out before, and Janet did bring this up, is that the claims data or electronic health record data, all the different data sources, one of the things we want to be able to do in each case is to enrich those data with other data elements that are complementary to that. So even in some of those environments that may be a node that will represent on this diagram, you want them to have the ability to get to other data when they need to. So if you're a health plan, you need to be able to get to chart. If you're electronic health record source, they need to be able to get to other sources of information such as claims data on those same patients so that we can see what's going on in those. We also want clinical information to enrich those because that gives us better acuity in understanding what's going on. The last principle that I'll expound upon here is that validating what we're seeing is really important, both in terms of validating the algorithms we use to generate signals, but also going from signal to validated event to try to assess causality is really, really important. So you have to have the ability within each of these systems to be able to validate on both of those domains. I'm certain that there are many other principles that could come from this group, but could come from the audience that we need to highlight and keep and hold near and dear as we make these decisions, but I really, this is, again, a big part of that decision point. So with that, instead of focusing on databases, one of the things that we're trying to put out is we need to focus on data environments and stay away from the database concept, although, at least in the beginning. And that doesn't mean we can't evolve to some of those aspects in terms of pooling some of the data going forward, but we need to understand those data and understand the processes and understand the sort of strengths and weaknesses of doing those things before we move down that road. And our focus needs to be working to link together those complementary data sources to get us to the breadth and depth we need to in order to accomplish this goal. So to go to the diagram very quickly, and I'll point out a few things, and I'm going to turn the mic over to Rich and to Janet to take this further. One is to talk about the 5 nodes, and actually I'll stand up. If you look at the 5 nodes we have here are what we're representing those as being data environments. And the number is not the important factor because there could be 20 nodes or 2 nodes, whatever. But in this case, those are the data environments that I was referring to before. Within each one of those data environments, we put in there as a local analytics group. And the reason that that's in there is because what you really want to start with is working with organizations that have experience using that particular data environment to generate evidence. Because they'll understand not just the nuances of the data, but to understand how to translate whatever the question of the day is, whatever event we're looking for, into a process or a research protocol that will effectively generate that information. The second part is to look at that network coordinating center. And the concept is that network coordinating center can have many charges, but it will be made up primarily of representatives from each one of those data environments. And their job is to work collaboratively to help reach those goals of speed, of acuity, of efficiency, and accuracy. You also could have that representation from other sources, including the FDA, that sit in that group as well to help provide guidance on this. But again, that's for us would be the coordinating of many things, including communications. The third piece that I would point out is that this concept of a Sentinel System Coordinating Center, and that would be a body from the FDA. And I think that could be very similar to what you pointed out as that convener. It could be something along those lines, Janet, that I think it could have a number of functions, but it would have, and I like we've got the same scientific advisory board concept out there, and I like I agree with your comments about that scientific advisory board, and would think it would play a very important role, a critical role in all of this in terms of methods development, in terms of standards development, et cetera. The fourth piece, the last piece I'll point out is this project research organization and project research committee. And the idea is that on a given project, the FDA would make the decisions as to who to engage, probably through a competitive bid process, for a specific project. So it could be one of these local research organizations, or it could be an outside organization that has the experience, the skills, and the talent to be able to conduct that project. But the box below that, it's an important one. I mean, what I mean by what we're trying to represent in that particular circle or oval is that a project research committee would be made up of representatives from the research organization itself, other outside expertise, but very importantly, representatives from the research environments from which or within which that particular project is going to be conducted, so that the insight, the local knowledge that's necessary to use that database or use that data environment is actually brought to the table for that specific project. So that's a starting point in terms of the discussion. And again, I think, Mark, I agree with you. This is there's not the answers, but it is something we want to put forth as getting us closer to where we need to get to field that system.
Thank you very much, Marcus. Rich?
Okay, thanks. So when embarking on a really transformative process like this, it's helpful to know whether it's really going to be possible to make it work. And I'm going to spend the next few minutes talking about some of the things that have already been accomplished, I think, give us reason to believe that that this really can succeed, and to outline some of the things that are going to be necessary in order to get from where we are to where we'd like to be. First, there's a pretty good working demonstration of many of the attributes that Dr. von Eschenbach, Dr. Woodcock, and Marcus have talked about. That's the vaccine safety data link that the Centers for Disease Control operates, that currently is operating as a distributed network of 8 health plans with 11 million individuals that does prospective signal detection to assess the safety of recently marketed vaccines. So it has the things about it that are shared features with the network that we're talking about are that there are well-defined populations, that it combines electronic medical records and claims data. It has developed and uses novel statistical methods that allow frequent updating of observations so you can find a signal at the earliest possible time. It uses distributed networking methods so that programs are developed centrally and then distributed so that they run behind the firewalls, and personal information is protected because it never leaves the health plans. And finally, there are knowledgeable local experts who work in partnership with the CDC and FDA in developing, implementing, and interpreting the protocols that are developed. So the several big questions for us are, can these kinds of activities scale up to the size that the Sentinel network needs to be? Will it work for drugs? Much more complicated set of issues that need to be dealt with. And can it work in environments that don't have complete data on both claims and electronic medical record information? I'll mention 4 things that are steps along the way in demonstrating the feasibility of that. First, several of us, Marcus, Arnold Chan at I3 Drug Safety, and several others are part of a 5 health plan consortium that's anchored in my department, in which we're doing a post-marketing evaluation of the relationship between the meningococcal conjugate vaccine and Guillain-Barré syndrome. It needs a large population because we're trying to look for very small increases in a very rare outcome. The total population is 50 million. We're using fully distributed methods to analyze those 50 million lives. The data all stays with the health plans, and it's working. There's no reason that it can't scale up the kinds of methods that we're using. Secondly, We have, as part of a contract that we have with the Center for Biologics at FDA, have done key informant interviews with the leaders of 11 public and private organizations that are responsible for the care of 150 million individuals, and they've indicated that they have the technical capacity to participate in a distributed network and would, in principle, be willing to participate. There's as Janet said, there's lots of things for lawyers to be involved in, and many others to make sure that organizations' needs can be met. But at least in principle, there's good reason to believe that it would be possible to build a network of the scale that we're talking about. Thirdly, we've worked in partnership with FDA and the Agency of Healthcare Research and Quality as part of one of these Centers for Education and Research and Therapeutics, or CERTs, to how are we doing here? To test signal detection mechanisms using sequential methods to identify signals associated with drugs rather than vaccines. And our first efforts in doing that appear to be successful. That is, we have been able to use historical data to show that if we had been analyzing it in a sequential fashion, we would have been able to find signals that we know exist in with regard to those drugs. So we have at least some reason to believe that it will be possible to adapt these methods. And finally, we've partnered with I3 Drug Safety to apply these kinds of sequential methods to very large claims databases, and it looks as though they'll work. So there's a fair amount that we've already accomplished. I'd say that there are at least 8 important needs that we have to address in order to get to the kind of diagram that either Dr. Woodcock or Marcus showed. One is I think we have to be able to show that we can do signal detection prospectively on databases that, as Marcus said, are created for other purposes and are being adapted for these uses. And it's probably doable, but it's not a straightforward thing to do. And so I think that it's important to test these methods in a prospective fashion. Secondly, we have to develop additional statistical methods to allow us to do signal detection in an appropriate way and to have better methods for distributed analysis. There are certain kinds of things that are still very difficult to do in a distributed fashion, and we need to be able to accomplish that. We need to come to consensus about the definitions of the outcomes we're interested in. That is, when spontaneous reports are submitted to the FDA, it's clear that somebody has decided that a person has liver failure. But we need to develop the conventions that let us go to these very large data environments and say, how do we find the individuals who have liver failure or renal failure or bone marrow injury? And so there's work to do to develop standard definitions that have reasonable performance capabilities. Signal detection is only part of the challenge because there are many reasons that the signals don't mean that there's really a problem with the agent. Those are problems with the way the data happens to show up. It has to do with ways that clinicians use coding systems which change over space and time. And finally, when a signal is determined to be a real association, we get through the, or can we believe the data, there's still going to be the important challenge of deciding whether the drug caused the problem or whether the drug is associated with the problem. That's not a new challenge. That's been a major piece of the FDA's work for as long as I've been active professionally. But I think that there's going to be a change in scale in the number of signals that are going to have to be evaluated and the speed with which they'll have to be evaluated. And our nation doesn't have the professional bandwidth to do that work now, so there's a scaling up of capabilities that'll be needed. I haven't talked at all about the fact that we actually need to develop the network architecture that is, those arrows? Those arrows are a really important set of challenges. It will clearly be possible to build that network that allows efficient and secure communications But that's work that we have to do, and it's not entirely straightforward. We need to develop the communications protocols that we've already alluded to. At what point do you communicate what information to whom? And the most important whom is us as a nation, who need to have reasonable expectations that information that's developed will become available. The final thing I'll mention is that I think we need to have a national conversation about what are appropriate uses of individual medical records that also serve a public health purpose. I think that is most important with regard to the way we use Medicare data. On the same day that the Sentinel Initiative was announced, there was a very important announcement that Medicare drug exposure data will be available and linked to other information about Medicare recipients, making it Medicare data instantaneously the very most important resource that the Sentinel network will have. But it will really only be fully useful if there's an agreement that when there is a need, that appropriately authorized individuals can have access to a very small number of full-text medical records to confirm the specific outcomes of interest. That may mean that looking over millions of records, it's important to review hundreds to try to answer the question of whether a signal is a real event or not. But without that ability, it's going to seriously diminish the utility of that record. And so I bring it up as my final point because it's both very important, and I haven't heard any real discussion about making that final link. And so I think it needs to be on the high priority list. So I'll turn the mic over to Janet.
Thanks, Rich. Janet, please go ahead.
So Marcus talked about the goals of an active surveillance network and some of the key components of a distributed network. And then we heard Rich provided some examples or models that might provide some input or lay the foundation for moving this work forward, and also define some of the key questions. I'm just going to spend a few moments this morning talking about the availability of different data sets and different sources that can support the Sentinel initiative while protecting patient privacy and confidentiality. As noted, if you look in the Sentinel Initiative white paper, as well as the various communication pieces and listen this morning, Sentinel intends to draw upon a rich set of data sources. And there are many, many data types, particularly now, that are needed to support signal detection and validation in our country. Ultimately, we think that Sentinel could draw upon clinical information, whether it's from laboratories or pharmacies, electronic health records in integrated delivery systems in hospitals. Of course, the growing number of health information exchange initiatives that are happening locally, and in some cases at the state level across our country, and perhaps data from large physician practices, all doing so in a way that carefully protects patient privacy and confidentiality. I think, in fact, that these connections are going to be important because when you think about the long term, we're sending queries out to get information back, but then we're going to want to close that loop and begin to reach out to the care delivery system to provide information to those who work with patients every day. The other thing, and particularly in the last year, we're seeing a lot of interest in personal health records. We've all seen the news around Microsoft or Google, and even sites, consumer-facing applications like Patients Like Me, where thousands of patients with illnesses are sharing their experiences, things, and I know there's a lot more research that needs to be conducted, but thinking broadly about the end in mind, how do we leverage what works today and build upon that, but keep the end in mind around this connected electronic infrastructure that protects patient privacy, but gives us what we need to greatly improve not only the quality, but the effectiveness of our healthcare system. Helping the wind behind our backs and moving some of this clinical data forward is all the activity that's happening not only at the national level but also at the state level. We're seeing a lot of movement on standards identification, harmonization and adoption with leadership by the federal government now moving into the private sector. We're seeing pilots emerge from CMS. We might just see some legislation that encourages in the early years through bonuses, physician adoption of electronic prescribing through the Medicare program, and then just thinking through that impact on the data that's out there. So what are some examples of using clinical data sets to support post-market surveillance or similar activities? I'm going to share some results of our Connecting Communities collaboration that Janet referenced earlier this morning for drug safety, which we shared a bit at the last Brookings Roundtable in January. We're basically focused on testing in 2 environments, both at Reagan Street Institute in Indianapolis and Partners Healthcare System in Boston, a set of 3 use cases. The use of statins and liver toxicity is the first, warfarin-related bleeding episodes, and then a small set of DMEs. And we wrapped up in April our first iteration of testing, we did so. We wanted to look at 3 types of data: claims data only, looking at clinical data, electronic clinical data, and, claims and lab was the second experiment, and then looking at clinical data to see if there were differences, not only in the different data types, but also in the different environments. And what we found in the team, and there's some team members here in the room, we're going through our second iteration of testing right now to further validate our results this summer, but we are seeing that there are some differences depending on the data types that you use, right? Whether it's claims or clinical, and we're also seeing that there are differences in the environments. And so what it raises for us, long story short, there is much to learn regarding the use of various methods and the usefulness of different data sets. All necessary and important, but thinking about how they fit together. And this is one of the key elements of the Sentinel initiative, the public-private partnership, is to create an environment to test methods by different organizations and initiatives and quickly feed that information back so we can all learn and get better to serve our nation's drug safety goals. There are examples of the use of clinical data, and particularly in distributed environments, and Rich talked about some of them. There's some others that are moving forward, like SPIN or I2B2, clearly the work of the CERTs, and some in other environments, like public health. There's some interesting work through an initiative called Distribute that is also moving this work forward that we can learn from. And I think there's a great deal of expertise to draw upon as we move this forward. So in closing, I want to just run through, based on our experiences, not only within the Connecting Communities Collaborative, but in a broad multi-stakeholder coalition that's thinking a lot about how one connects data both within communities across our country, but across the country in a way that appropriately protects patient privacy, and some principles to think about. One of the most important principles, and what I'm pleased to hear about this morning from the presentation, is building and leveraging what's already been done. And so I think we've got some near-term opportunities to just do it and to build on things that folks have done, but also keeping the end in mind, because it's a very heterogeneous environment out there. It's, depending on what data types you have in different environments, the standards that are being applied or not, even the proprietary nature of the data. And if you go locally across different states, the culture around policies for information sharing are different. So the thing, what's going to be really interesting in light of that, and given this environment, I think one of the most critical elements of building Sentinel is almost to create, in addition to an electronic network, a social network, if you will, that brings together the best and the brightest, and maybe not so, that is inclusive, and it doesn't shut people out, but brings people in to share their experiences about what works and what doesn't work. And also, and this is what I learned, who's in here, New York last summer when we kicked off our collaborative. Funny things happen when you get together informatics people with epidemiologists and folks that are, safety experts. experts from two different environments. Magic happens, and the sort of brain power and the combination of sharing is really exciting, and we were able to break new ground. Just imagine doing this on a national scale. And so I think this notion of a social environment, in addition to one that focuses on the technical aspects, will really be important. Some final points, because I think we're getting ready to wrap up here, is we're going to talk later about governance. I talked about the importance of inclusiveness. We already talked about the importance of a decentralized, distributed approach, particularly addressing head-on issues around privacy and confidentiality, and building those policies for information sharing into the front end will be very important. So just imagine a collaborative learning environment that doesn't force one set of protocols or principles from the get-go, but one which brings different disciplines and different experts from across the field to come together to solve one of the nation's biggest issues, which is around drug safety. And I'm excited about the work that the public-private partnership with the leadership of the FDA can do to make this happen, not only to address drug safety issues in our country, but even more importantly, and what I'm very excited about, is building this notion of an electronic health information infrastructure that respects patients' privacy and confidentiality, that can help us tackle broad issues in our healthcare system around quality, around effectiveness, around access in healthcare. So.
Thank you very much, Janet. Thank all the panelists for their presentations. Now, I'd like to open this up to questions and discussions. Once again, if people could raise their hands with questions, we'll get a mic for you, and remember to identify who you are and where you're from.
Hi, I'm Kathy Sigler from United Biosource, and it's a very exciting time, I guess, for epidemiologists. What I'm wondering is, are we hoping to track people across data environments? Are we going to have a unique patient identifier? That's one question. And the second one is, as we do this, I would be tempted to try and get data standards put in place so that all these environments are collecting things the same way. How much energy will be that way to try and standardize?
I'd say Sentinel Network 1.0 will not track across sources. And so it'll be, and that'll be okay, I think, because there are currently more than 100 million people's worth of data environments in which there's at least several years of reasonably complete data for individuals. It's not everything, and you could do better if you could link them, but it's possible to get this started without doing the linking across. With regard to the linking across, so imagine how you would want to do that in version 2, because it would be important, among other things, to be able to link the kind of data that a health plan has with a vital statistics registry. Just mashing to the National Death Index would be an important thing to do. It's possible. I'm talking about things I don't really understand, but it is. But I'm an academic, so that's okay. The Markle Foundation's Connecting for Health initiative is hosting a series of conversations about topics like how you can match across databases with neither data owner disclosing identifiable information. And so I'll say the magic word, one-way hash systems that would allow a neutral convener to be able to say, without knowing who the people are, person number 67 in your data set is the same as person number 85 in your other data set, and then for an appropriate purpose like this particular investigation, you could put that identifiable data together. So it won't be necessary to create a master patient index or to pull all the data, even when you're putting the data together. So that's the in 5 to 10 years kinds of kind of thing that we'd handle, I think.
If I might add to that, though, I think we do have an opportunity in phase 1 of Sentinel to actually link patient data. In fact, that's precisely what we did in the Connecting Communities collaboration in 2 markets, in Boston and Indiana, using a record locator service. We pulled data from many hospitals across the system, laboratories, physician practices. So I would say absolutely in phase 1. And I don't think it's something that could happen on a nationwide basis. And certainly HHS is helping us move forward on standards to make that happen. But clearly it's happening in a handful of markets across the U.S.
Just to follow up on that, we may talk about this a little bit more when we get to the data and methods discussions in a little while. Janet, the pilots that you've done, you could be regarded as a data environment, albeit an integrated data environment where together at the regional level you all have worked out a lot of issues that haven't been worked out on the national level to permit a kind of richer database contribution to this effort nationally, even though we're not really there on the national methods for doing that kind of linkage. Is that something you see fitting in with this initiative in the short term?
Absolutely. And I think, Rich, you mentioned the Connecting for Health. Boston and Indiana, and I know that Rob Kolodner's spearheading some efforts through the Zenhin trial implementations too, but 2 years ago, we actually were able to test across 2 markets and do linking there as well. Now, you have to deal with differing policies, privacy policies, and that's hard, but it's absolutely doable. Mark, and I don't know if you want to say anything else about that. No? Okay.
Marcus, did you have
There's not much to add to that because I think you made the main points, but it was one of those principles that I talked about early on and that we're thinking about is ability to enrich the data, and part of it's enriching in the current environment in which the patient's in, but your point about being able to bridge data across systems as patients move through the system over time, I think that's an important spot to get to. I think it's something we have to aspire to.
I mean, there's one more thing. You asked about standardizing. That's going to be a huge piece of work to even to have age mean the same thing across various data sources. I mean, take nothing for granted in how much sort of fighting through the swamp the actual implementation is going to be. It's important not to underestimate how much sort of ground level data element by data element discussion there will have to be to put together this sort of very high level concept. I think for that reason, 1.0 is going to need to get started on existing standards. So Medicare claims represent a lot of people, and so I think that standard industry kind of claims definitions are going to be the place to start, and even then it's going to be quite a considerable amount of work to make the stuff be reliable.
But you know what? The interesting thing about standards, I mean, Sentinel also offers an opportunity to help us get to an interoperable healthcare system. So while we don't start there, if you look at the work that CMS and what we're doing on quality, we're beginning to embed standards to help drive the system to our ultimate goal, which is interoperability.
Good question. Sorry, Janet.
Yeah, I think this is a key issue, but it is more of a longer-term issue. And I agree with Janet. What we're hoping is that if we can come together as this sort of research community on this, then we can help sort of incentivize and help enlist people in the need for standards rather than, because people will see how they will benefit them and the analyses they're trying to do. And that usually is the biggest motivating factor if it's something that's going to do something for you. But it's clear talking to NIH that, if we're going to get the genomics revolution nailed down, we're going to have the phenotypes understood. And a phenotype is basically like an epidemiologic case definition of some sort. And until we have all that, what we really need to do eventually is link the finding to some hard science, to some basic science about why the problem happened to those individuals. And until we can define actually what they had, at some greater level of specificity so we can subset them, we're not going to be able to do that. So the basic science research community, I think, will also be motivated to start getting these definitions in place. If we can enlist them in that effort, once we get this started, then I can see us moving into the standards effort in a more substantive way.
I'm trying to add.
Okay, it's Anna.
Yes,
Can you
Anna
say-
Sharfman from FDA. I'm trying to add the point of view of somebody that touches the data intensively. And the way that I see it, we need to reduce the uncertainties that we have when we are finding safety signals. And how can we do it? How can we sure that something really exists? And how reproducible that signal is. This is similar to, I'm old enough to have seen how difficult it was to assess clinical laboratory data in the beginning of my medical career because there were not standards in place. And then it's an iterative process. We set up standards. With standard data, it takes us 5 minutes to load the data into a standardized tool and start analyzing it versus, Janet, how many months could take to form the data, etc. Then, but we need analytical tools. It's not only to create standards in theory. I am sure that we are going to lose. It's very important, that groundwork. But we need also systematic tools in place because then we will be able to understand which are the missing pieces. There is an iterative process, and to be able to analyze more than 4 issues, there are some low-hanging fruits. To be able, I'm now paraphrasing Norman Stockbridge from the FDA, that he's saying which are the most important problems, safety problems that we need to deal, and to do it in a systematic way.
Thank you.
So Rich or Marcus might talk about the analytical methods, but let me go back to the social environment example. And what would be so interesting is, so we run a query, someone finds something. Let's say we've got 100 organizations in this social environment or network. Number 7 finds something, but instead of, we're not sure. So you reach out to the other 99, and they run it also, and you share your methods, and then you figure out whether this is really something. And this can happen in this environment quickly in a way that FDA can evaluate the impact of the different environments and the methods, and maybe you get somewhere faster and with more certainty. But Rich, I'm sure.
Well, one thing that I think will be extremely important to pick up on your point, Anna, is that we need to protect this enterprise from throwing off false alarms that will diminish its credibility. And I think one way to start doing that is to agree at the outset that only certain kinds of questions will be asked at a first pass. That is, rather than say, we'll sort of blindly look for every association that could be there. We'll say we will only look in an organized way for signals associated with the most common causes of serious drug-related problems. So that's the list of designated medical events. It's for each drug or drug class. It might be a small number of additional things for which there's reason to believe that you need to be on alert. And otherwise, you would use the system to confirm questions that arise from other sources. The spontaneous report system or an independent study or a clinical trial raises a question, you could seek to confirm it, but not to use it as a source of sort of unguided data mining. Even if we do that, I think that it's going to be a very important challenge to get to the right level of being sensitive to signals that exist and not being diverted by things that prove to be a false alarm. I mean, we've seen in the vaccine safety data link sort of the potential risks of finding a signal that takes a while to sort out, but in that period between you're not sure what it means, you're not sure that it's not a signal, and sort of an obligation to report, there's a potential to really erode sort of public confidence in the immunization system. And so there's a real challenge in that.
I think there's two
Got-
parts. Just one thing to add to that. But there's two parts that I think are really could be big problems with the system if we don't address them early on. One is the false positives, which we talked about. And I think if we go at it with purpose, I think in any specific endeavor, I think we can minimize that. The other part of it is we really haven't it was mentioned, but it really hasn't been talked about to any great extent. But it's a task that we have to take on very quickly in this process, and that is to lay out what's the communications process for signals when we see them. Who do we communicate to whom and when? And I think that's something we've talked about it in many forums, including with Janet and her team. And we have to lay that out because I think that it could be one of the biggest risks. It could also be one of the best ways to mitigate some of the issues we may see when we see a signal. Then how do we actually go from signal to validation very quickly, but also in the meantime, how do we master that communications process?
So this is a great setup for the next panel. Let me see if there was one more question here, I think, and then I want to take them to, okay, let's do two more questions, but real quick. Go ahead, there and here. Go ahead.
So, hi, it's Glenn Gormley here, now with Geminex. Let me link into the last comment, and Rich, pick up on your point of bringing the public along with us. So one of the potential derailers of this process, as I see it, is the public one day wakes up and realizes that their data is being used by people that they don't know and understand in ways they don't understand it. And then the people that think they represent the public have their own agendas or issues. How do we engage the public along this process? And who represents the public? Who would we talk with so that there isn't a sudden waking up? And when we get to the point where all this becomes operational, the public sees it as a good thing for them and not something to be afraid of because of not understanding it. How do we
Let
do
me
that?
just add that we are going to come back to this after the break, so very brief.
You can hold that then if you'd like.
So my 10-second answer is we need a broad public conversation, and we should frame this as a public health activity. And we already have the expectation that for appropriate public health needs, that public health agencies have access to patient-level data.
Okay, and one more question right here.
Trinka Koster from the Army. 2 points. Our healthcare is getting more expensive, and I presume everybody else's as well. And a couple of the things that we're looking at is, as you know, the Medicare has provide us with new codes that help us look at certain laboratory values. Such as A1C being greater than 9, you actually have an ICU-9 code and some other information in there. But the difficulty for us as a medical organization is it's maybe a couple of years before our contracts are in place and we pay the additional price for additional coding. In addition, we're looking at investigating enriching claims data with actual laboratory data. But the price of that also is high. And I didn't know if any other organizations are pursuing trying to ask for labs to be brought in with their claims data. And if you do have that experience, how did you prioritize the labs that you wanted to be brought in? And secondly, how much did that cost you to bring it in? And also the help then is and what kind of patients, because clearly if you ask for everything, you're going to pay for everything. Thank you.
There are many efforts, many organizations, including ours, that have successfully brought lab result data and integrated with the claims data. We can talk about it more offline if you'd like, but the process is not an exact one. It's not inexpensive, and often you have to make sure you're getting the right labs attached to the right other claims lines that are in there as well. So that process there are good ways to do it. There are organizations, many of them, including Arnold's group, that have done the same type of thing that are out there, and I'm sure that there's many places you can go to talk to about how they did it and what it cost to get it done.
It sounds like you guys should talk. I know there are more questions. These are all going to, we're going to have some more opportunities to address them after the break. I'd like to take a short break now. We're going to reconvene at 10:45. Thank you all very much.